President Putin has always made his position, the position of Russia, very, very clear. That's never changed. The real question here is, why should the Russians believe anything we say? This goes all the way back to the coup in 2014, the subsequent Minsk Accords, the arms control arrangements that we unilaterally dismissed out of hand is unnecessary. Why believe anything we say? And I think President Putin has been very straightforward and honest with President Trump. And people keep telling President Trump, well, he has to give something. If he doesn't give up his position in some way, you lose. You have to be a winner.
You know, when I hear that line, I'm reminded how often Washington treats foreign policy like reality TV. Somebody always has to win. Folks my age have seen that mindset backfire again and again, from Vietnam to Iraq. Real victories are quiet. Stable borders, open trade lanes, fewer body bags coming home. Putin keeps repeating his red lines because, to him, survival isn't a game show. If we keep looking for photo ops instead of durable deals, we may end up tallying losses no one can spin away.
This is the confusing aspect of the whole thing, because President Trump was far more rational 8 or 9 months ago when he recognized there was nothing happening in this area called Eastern Ukraine that justified the expenditure of American blood and treasure, nothing to be won, and that he really wanted to end the war. But every time he's tried to end the war, he's got people like Lindsey Graham saying, now, come on there, President, you've been played. Don't you understand? You've been played. And that kind of thing, I think, sadly resonates with President Trump. You listen to him on the golf course, and he says, you've been played. You can't allow this to happen. It's a lot of nonsense. We don't have any interest whatsoever in what happens in Eastern Ukraine. We never did. And Trump has always had it within his power to end this thing by simply declaring that and pulling out. But we want to be seen, or President Trump wants to be seen, as the heroic figure that brought about peace.
Wanting credit is human, but history rarely hands out solo trophies. Think Camp David. Carter wanted a win, yet it took Sadat and Begin swallowing pride to make it stick. If ego drives the agenda today, durable peace will slip through the cracks the moment cameras shut off.
They still live in a fantasy world. As we've said repeatedly from the beginning, they continue to believe the nonsense that Russia is weak, that Russian society is fragile, that Putin is a quote-unquote hated dictator. We are the good liberal Democrats that want to bring peace and happiness everywhere, which in reality means we want to bring in a bunch of some of the lowest forms of human life in the private sector to rape Russia, steal everything they can from it while we put a puppet in Moscow.
That playbook sounds awfully familiar. 1990s Moscow, early 2000s Baghdad, even Libya after 2011. Each time, the promised market miracle morphed into oligarchs, black markets, and simmering rage. When locals feel looted, they don't queue up for democracy, they reach for the nearest strongman.
Did Trump's bombing of Iran make the Middle East more stable or more volatile?
Not only is it more volatile, we are at war with Iran, and people don't seem to understand it. Simply because President Trump dropped bombs and then said, well, that's it. Now we want peace.
Bombs first, coffee later. It never works. Think of Gaza 2024. Airstrikes ended, but the blockade kept anger boiling. Peace takes sequencing. Ceasefire, trust building, then aid. Flip that order, and you trade short-term applause for long-term firefights.
So I'm sending over coffee and sandwiches this afternoon, and we're going to get along and work together, is irrelevant. We are a co-belligerent with Israel at war in the region, and effectively we're at war with everybody because Israel's at war with everyone at this stage. So, I think people don't understand. There was an Israeli named Yanon who, back in the 1980s, set forth a plan for the region. And it didn't work out quite as anticipated, but 40 years later, it now rings true. And he simply said, our first goal in the region is fragmentation, division. In other words, break up the region into smaller packets that are more easily managed by us.
Fragmentation sounds neat on a briefing slide, but balkanizing societies usually seeds forever wars. Yugoslavia's 1990s breakup spawned 6 states and countless grudges. The Middle East would multiply that by 10. Stability grows from inclusive borders, not lines a distant capital redraws on a map.
In addition to that, once they're fragmented, we want to pit them against each other. Then we want to subjugate, clean up, and ultimately resettle areas with Jews, replacing the populations who are there. That's what Bibi Netanyahu is all about. That's what he's doing. It's kind of interesting if you go back and look at Sharon and Gaza. We had problems with what Sharon was doing in Gaza in about 2001 through 2003. And ultimately, President Bush at the time told Sharon to get out of Gaza. And ultimately, they got out. He wanted to go in there and bulldoze houses and level places. And we said, we're not going to support that. Get out of Gaza. So he got out of Gaza. He came up with this new arrangement. It turned Gaza into a larger concentration camp, but at least it ended the intrusive measures by the Israelis on the ground. They got out, and the idea was that they would focus on securing Israel. Well, the roles have changed. It's no longer a question of the president telling the prime minister of Israel what to do.
Power dynamics flip when one partner writes the talking points and the other foots the bill. Veterans of the Cold War remember how smaller allies could drag superpowers into local vendettas. If DC isn't careful, it may be outsourcing its foreign policy and its deterrence credibility without realizing it.
Are we slouching toward World War III?
Well, we're also continuing to try and argue that we are confronting this thing called aggressive China over Taiwan.
Juggling two proxy wars is tough. Adding a third against the world's largest economy borders on hubris. Beijing just tested hypersonic glide vehicles again last week, tech we still struggle to intercept. Strategy is about priorities, and right now, ours look like a grocery list written at midnight.
In other words, we're still committed to the crazy, insane notion that we're going to wage war against the largest country in the world, whose missile arsenal makes Iran's look small and insignificant by comparison, and that somehow or another we're going to prevent the Chinese from establishing control over Taiwan. At the same time that we do that, the Chinese are ramping up because they see this as a threat to them. This is analogous to Cuba, an island offshore of the United States that has turned into an attack dog against us. So it's not just the two that you mentioned, it's all three. And we are really, really, really in over our heads. We're overwhelmed with logistical requirements that we can't meet. We can't sustain ourselves around the world in all three theaters.
Logistics decide wars more than slogans do. Ask any Gulf War quartermaster. Fuel hoses and spare parts, not speeches, kept the advance rolling. If supply chains are already stretched thin, talking tougher simply widens the credibility gap our adversaries love to exploit.
But no one wants to make the hard decision, which is what I talked about in the beginning. Do we back off? Do we recognize the problems we have at home? Do we deal with those problems, reform the economy, reform the way we govern, and move down a different road? In other words, do we willingly yield our political military hegemony over the globe? Because that's really what this is all about. Putin spoke earlier within the last 12 to 14 hours in an interview, and he said something that everyone in Washington should listen to. He said either Russia is independent and sovereign or it does not exist. So when you threaten Russia, you threaten it over the issues in Ukraine because those are existential for the Russians. They can't allow a hostile state to emerge there and threaten their existence. If you say you're going to sanction them beyond anything they've ever seen.
Sanctions can bite, but they can also bind rivals together. Look at the ruble-yuan trade volume. It's up nearly 250% since the 2022 sanction wave. The more we weaponize finance, the faster alternative systems sprout, and suddenly the dollar's sway isn't the given we once assumed.
With the goal of destroying their economy, they're saying we will fight. He's being polite about it. He's not bloviating the way President Trump would do. He's not saying, I'm going to crush them, I'm going to break them. He doesn't talk that way. These people are professionals in Moscow and Beijing. They're even professional in Tehran. They don't engage in this kind of rhetoric. But we need to understand something. He's serious. Either they are sovereign and independent, or they don't exist.
That's a sobering ultimatum, and it should ring louder in Washington than any campaign speech. Great powers survive by knowing where another nation's red lines end and annihilation begins. When Moscow or Beijing frames a conflict as existential, escalation ladders shorten, misreads multiply, and diplomacy's margin for error vanishes. The wiser course, hard as it feels politically, is to trade maximalist dreams for realistic security guarantees. Because once adversaries believe survival is at stake, every move afterward risks lighting a fuse we can't put out.